Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little unexpected but incredibly cozy, the reading benches built into the walls of early Icelandic homes. Picture this, a quiet, dimly lit room, the warmth of a hearth crackling in the corner, and a soft, rhythmic sound of a gourd instrument playing in the background as someone settles onto a bench carved into the very walls of the home. No ordinary furniture, these benches weren't just for sitting, they were a focal point for learning, storytelling, and preserving Iceland's literary culture. You probably won't survive this, because after hearing about this, you might find yourself wondering why we don't have built-in reading benches today, right? But, stick with me, because these benches weren't just about comfort, they were about a deeper cultural tradition. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see when and where this bedtime journey is reaching you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the Viking Age, Icelanders were a unique mix of warriors, settlers, and intellectuals. They were renowned for their storytelling, which was passed down orally for generations. But something changed when literacy arrived, and it was in this new chapter that reading benches started making their mark on Icelandic homes. These weren't just benches you'd sit on to relax, they were special, carved into the walls, often near the hearth, providing a quiet nook perfect for reading or reflecting on the sagas that shaped their culture. Historians still argue whether the Icelanders' embrace of reading was directly linked to their Viking heritage or if it was more influenced by their isolation and desire to preserve their own unique culture. Either way, one thing is clear, Icelanders had a deep commitment to preserving stories, knowledge, and law through written word. The humble reading bench played a crucial role in this, offering a dedicated space for literature in a time when books were precious, rare, and often hand-copied. These benches weren't just practical. They became a central part of the home, often surrounded by family, warmth, and light. Think about it, what better place to sit and read through the sagas, the stories of gods, heroes, and the origins of Iceland itself, than on a bench carefully built into your home's walls? It wasn't just about comfort, it was about connecting to your heritage, fostering a sense of community, and honoring your ancestors who, through storytelling, kept Iceland's history alive. So why benches? What makes them so important to early Icelanders? Well, these weren't just any benches, these were functional works of art, integrated into the very fabric of the home, created specifically for a culture deeply rooted in its own literary and storytelling traditions. This wasn't just about having a place to sit, it was about having a dedicated space for stories, for law, and for culture to unfold in the quiet of the evening. Let's take a closer look at how the reading bench fit into the daily life of early Icelanders. These benches weren't just a piece of furniture, they were central to the structure of their homes. Built into the walls, often near the hearth where the warmth from the fire would radiate, these benches became the spot for storytelling, reading, and reflection. In a society where much of life was lived outdoors or in communal spaces, the reading bench offered a quiet, personal nook for the pursuit of knowledge. Historians still argue whether these benches were strictly a functional addition or if they had a deeper cultural significance. Some scholars suggest that these benches were a reflection of the Icelandic value placed on education and literacy, offering a designated place to read and think. Others believe that the benches had a more spiritual function, as they were often found near the hearth, a symbol of warmth, life, and protection. In this sense, the reading bench wasn't just a place to rest, it was a space imbued with significance, a place where family members could connect to the past, to their culture, and to each other through reading and storytelling. The Icelandic sagas, those epic tales of gods, heroes, and the origins of the Viking world, were often recited in the warmth of homes, and the reading bench played an important role in this tradition. These stories were essential to the Icelanders' sense of identity. The sagas weren't just entertainment, they were a way of preserving history, passing down knowledge, and binding the community together through shared experiences. The bench, positioned as the focal point of the home, allowed for a quiet space where these stories could be read aloud, recited, or discussed, reinforcing the community's ties to their history and their collective sense of self. When we think about the Icelandic sagas today, we often picture them in the context of Viking warriors, explorers, and conquerors. However, for the Icelandic families who lived in small, isolated communities, these sagas were a way of holding on to their culture and traditions. In a harsh, often unforgiving environment, the reading bench was a symbol of resilience, a place where the community could come together and reflect on their shared experiences. The reading bench wasn't just about the act of reading, it was about preserving the stories that defined Iceland's identity, stories that connected each generation to the next. But why go to the trouble of building these benches into the walls of homes? Why not just use regular furniture? Well, Icelanders were resourceful people, and space was limited in their homes. The homes were typically small, built with thick walls and low ceilings, designed to conserve heat during the harsh winters. So, building a bench directly into the wall allowed the Icelanders to maximize their limited space. The bench also served as a central part of the home's layout, often positioned next to the hearth, where the family would gather around for warmth, meals, and storytelling. It wasn't just about convenience, it was about making the most of the space in a way that reflected their values. Historians still debate whether this built-in style of seating was purely functional, or if it had deeper meaning tied to Icelandic cultural values. Some argue that it was a necessity born out of practicality, the need to save space in small, cramped homes. Others suggest that the way the bench was integrated into the walls reflects a cultural appreciation for simplicity and functionality, values deeply ingrained in Icelandic life. Regardless of the reasoning, it's clear that the reading bench was more than just a place to sit, it was a purposeful, meaningful part of the home that contributed to the social, cultural, and intellectual life of early Icelanders. So, when you picture those quiet evenings in early Iceland, with families gathered around the fire and stories being read aloud on the reading benches, think about how this small piece of furniture represented a much larger cultural and intellectual tradition. The reading bench wasn't just a place to sit, it was a space for reflection, learning, and connection to the past. And in that simplicity, it carried the weight of Iceland's rich literary tradition, keeping stories alive and ensuring that the culture would endure for generations to come. As we continue to reflect on the central role of reading benches in Icelandic homes, it's worth considering how these simple pieces of furniture were part of a much larger cultural practice, one that emphasized the importance of literacy, storytelling, and community. These benches were not just functional, but integral to the practice of reading the Icelandic sagas, which were not only epic tales of warriors and gods but also repositories of legal, cultural, and family history. Reading these sagas wasn't just an evening pastime, it was a ritual, a way of keeping the Icelandic identity alive. The importance of the sagas cannot be overstated. These stories, which began as oral traditions passed down through generations, were eventually written down on parchment and codified in the 13th century. They formed the foundation of Icelandic culture, law, and identity. But where did this tradition of storytelling begin, and how did the reading bench become a focal point for it? Historians still argue whether the Icelanders' dedication to the sagas was born out of necessity or cultural pride. Were the sagas a tool to preserve their history in an ever-changing world, or were they simply an outlet for the creative spirit of a people who lived in isolation for much of the year? What's fascinating about the Icelandic commitment to the written word is that, even in a society so remote and largely reading and storytelling were not only reserved for the elite. Iceland was unique in that literacy was widespread across social classes, even among the rural population. This is where the reading bench becomes significant. These benches were not just for the wealthy or the powerful. They were found in the homes of farmers, tradesmen, and common folk as well. Everyone had access to the sagas, and everyone could participate in the rituals surrounding them. It wasn't about social class, it was about a shared cultural identity. The reading bench became a symbol of that shared heritage, where families could come together after a long day, read stories aloud, and bond over their common history. In a small Icelandic home, space was precious. Most homes were one-room structures, with thick walls designed to protect against the harsh northern winters. The idea of incorporating reading benches into the walls wasn't just about saving space, it was about creating a space for education, family interaction, and spiritual nourishment. These benches were central to the home, often located next to the hearth, where families would gather around for warmth and food. By building the bench into the wall, Icelanders made a practical decision to utilize every available space, but also an emotional and cultural one. The reading bench wasn't just a place to sit, it was where the soul of the family lived, where stories were passed down, lessons were taught, and bonds were strengthened. Historians still debate the significance of the reading bench in relation to Icelandic education and law. Some argue that these benches, as a place where people gathered to read the sagas, were the birthplace of Iceland's democratic traditions. The sagas weren't just stories, they were legal documents, written records of agreements, oaths, and the very foundation of Iceland's medieval parliament, the Althing. Could the reading benches, in their quiet role as homes for the sagas, have played a part in shaping the democratic ideals that Iceland is known for today? The idea of common people reading and discussing the sagas, of engaging with law and history directly in their homes, may have been one of the driving forces behind Iceland's early embrace of democracy. Interestingly, the Althing, established around 930 AD, is one of the oldest parliaments in the world, and it's believed that much of its early legal structure was influenced by the sagas. In fact, many sagas recount events involving the Althing, the Icelandic lawmen, and the way the laws were passed. What's particularly interesting is how the reading of these stories helped to reinforce the values of justice, fairness, and communal decision-making. The sagas were often read aloud in front of families, sometimes in the presence of local chieftains or other community leaders. In this sense, the reading bench might not have just been a place for stories, it may have also acted as a platform for informal governance, where laws and traditions were discussed, interpreted, and passed down. The debate continues about how much of this cultural and political process was formalized in the home versus the public sphere. Could the reading bench have played such an active role in Icelandic political life? Or was it just a peaceful, everyday ritual that allowed Icelanders to stay connected with their past and their values? Whether for legal reflection or just storytelling, the presence of the reading bench in nearly every home was a clear indication of how central the written word, and the oral traditions it stemmed from, were to the Icelandic way of life. This cultural focus on reading and storytelling is not unique to Iceland, of course. Many cultures value storytelling as a way to maintain social order, pass down wisdom, and preserve identity. However, what sets the Icelandic tradition apart is the extent to which the written word, specifically the sagas, became integral to everyday life. The reading bench became more than just a functional piece of furniture, it became the heart of the home, where the most important traditions were shared and maintained. As we continue to explore the significance of the reading benches in early Icelandic homes, it's essential to delve into the physical and architectural design of these benches. These benches were not merely added to homes for practical purposes, they were thoughtfully integrated into the very structure of the house, which was often modest, compact, and designed to withstand the harsh Icelandic winters. Homes typically consisted of a single room with a central hearth that provided warmth for the entire space. In such small, closely knit environments, every piece of furniture needed to serve a specific function, and the reading bench was no exception. It wasn't just a place to sit and read, it was an essential feature of the home's design. The reading benches were typically built into the walls of the house, often near the hearth, allowing the occupant to benefit from the warmth while reading or engaging in the evening rituals. This strategic placement reflects a deep understanding of the environment. Keeping people warm while they read was a practical consideration, especially during the long Icelandic winters when daylight hours were short, and the nights stretched endlessly. By placing the bench near the hearth, Icelanders not only ensured comfort during the cold evenings but also created a dedicated space for reading that was central to the daily rhythms of life. These benches, usually built along the walls and with storage space underneath, were designed to maximize the use of limited space, making them both practical and functional. Historians still argue whether the design of these benches was influenced more by necessity or by an aesthetic desire to create a comfortable, communal space for reading and reflection. Some argue that the design was purely utilitarian, a reflection of the harsh living conditions and the need to conserve space. Others believe that the design had symbolic significance, reflecting the Icelanders' deep reverence for knowledge and the written word. In any case, it's clear that these reading benches were not just an afterthought in the home's construction, they were a fundamental part of the space, integrated into the architecture in a way that reinforced the value placed on reading and storytelling. The Icelandic homes of the time were built for practicality and efficiency, but this didn't mean that they lacked aesthetic value. The design of the reading bench was likely influenced by the Icelanders' appreciation for craftsmanship and functionality. In fact, the way the bench was incorporated into the home reflects the broader Icelandic culture of resourcefulness. The use of wood and other materials was not only a matter of practicality, it was also an expression of the connection between the people and the land they inhabited. These homes were not simply shelters from the elements, they were reflections of Icelandic values, built with care and attention to detail, ensuring that every piece of furniture, like the reading bench, had a purpose that aligned with the needs of the people who lived there. One intriguing aspect of these reading benches is how they mirrored the Icelandic people's approach to storytelling. Icelandic culture was rich in oral tradition, but as written language became more prominent, especially with the recording of the sagas, it's clear that the act of reading took on a new significance. The reading bench became more than just a place to read, it became a site of cultural transmission. Families would gather around the bench, where the sagas were read aloud and shared, reinforcing cultural identity and social cohesion. The benches were places of learning, where the wisdom of the past was passed down from one generation to the next. The reading bench also allowed Icelanders to take part in the broader tradition of literary culture. The Icelandic sagas were not just stories, they were essential cultural documents that conveyed the legal, social, and spiritual values of the people. Reading these sagas at night, by the warmth of the fire, was a way of staying connected to the past while ensuring that the stories and knowledge were preserved for future generations. As Icelanders read or listened to these sagas, they weren't simply being entertained, they were participating in an ongoing process of cultural and spiritual renewal. The reading bench, in this context, wasn't just a seat, it was a space for learning, reflection, and spiritual connection. The question remains, how much did these reading benches contribute to the spread of literacy in Iceland? Historians still argue whether literacy was widespread or if it was mainly confined to certain social classes. Some believe that the reading benches, along with the importance placed on the sagas, helped to foster literacy among all levels of society, from the elite to the common folk. Others suggest that literacy was mostly limited to the clergy and nobility, with reading benches serving as a space for the elite to study and reflect. Regardless of the exact role literacy played in Icelandic society, it's clear that the reading benches, and the act of reading, were central to the Icelandic way of life. As we continue to explore the deep cultural significance of the reading benches in early Icelandic homes, it's crucial to examine how these benches reflected the larger role of literature and storytelling in Icelandic society. The sagas were more than just epic tales of gods and heroes, they were the very fabric of Icelandic identity. They encapsulated the values, laws, and history of the Icelandic people. The reading bench, therefore, wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was a space dedicated to preserving and transmitting these sacred stories. It played a key role in the daily life of Icelanders, fostering an environment where storytelling was not just an entertainment, but a way of reinforcing social norms, teaching the next generation, and maintaining community ties. Historians still argue whether the reading bench was exclusively used for the sagas or whether other types of literature, including poetry, law texts, and religious writings, were also part of this nightly ritual. Some scholars suggest that the sagas were the primary form of literature read aloud on these benches, and families gathered around them to listen to stories that connected them to their ancestors and the greater history of the Viking world. Others argue that the sagas, though prominent, were part of a broader range of readings that also included legal texts, which helped to reinforce Iceland's strong tradition of law and governance. The Icelandic Althing, one of the oldest parliaments in the world, was closely linked to the sagas, as many of the sagas themselves chronicled the development of Icelandic law. For Icelanders, reading and storytelling weren't just about entertainment, they were essential parts of daily life and societal function. The practice of gathering around the reading bench helped solidify the importance of literature in Icelandic culture. Children were exposed to these stories at an early age, learning about their culture's heroes, the origins of their laws, and their moral values. It was through these stories that children learned about justice, leadership, and the complex relationships between gods, humans, and nature. These stories shaped their understanding of the world and provided guidance on how to navigate life's challenges. What's fascinating about the reading bench is how it turned an otherwise ordinary space into a hub of intellectual and cultural activity. Imagine an Icelandic family in the evening, sitting together near the fire, the warmth of the hearth mixing with the rhythmic sounds of the gourd instruments, which may have been played to accompany the stories. The children, still young and eager to absorb their heritage, listen intently to the sagas being read aloud by their parents or elders. Each story serves not only as entertainment but as a lesson, a way to connect with the past and pass down values to the next generation. Historians often debate the role of literacy in this tradition. Was it a privilege for the elite, or was literacy widespread among Icelandic families, regardless of class? Some argue that while the elite had easier access to written texts and were more likely to engage in reading, literacy in Iceland was relatively widespread. The tradition of storytelling, rooted in the Icelandic sagas, likely had a role in encouraging literacy, as many Icelanders would learn to read and write in order to preserve and share these stories. The reading bench, in this context, might have played a role in the transmission of literacy itself, especially if families actively participated in the reading process, with one family member reading while others listened, discussed, and reflected on the material. The idea of a reading bench wasn't unique to Iceland, but the Icelandic implementation of it speaks volumes about the society's values. The bench, as an architectural feature, emphasized the importance of the written word, both in preserving history and law, and in shaping the values of the community. It wasn't merely a place to sit, it was a place to engage in the culture and wisdom of the society. As families gathered around these benches, they weren't just spending time together, they were partaking in a cultural ritual that allowed them to maintain a deep connection to their identity and heritage. Interestingly, the use of a reading bench positioned near the hearth was likely not just for warmth. The hearth had its own deep significance in Icelandic society. It wasn't only a source of heat, it was the symbolic center of the home, where families came together, shared meals, and engaged in storytelling and reading. The reading bench, nestled beside the hearth, created a sense of security, warmth, and community. It was not just about comfort, it was about connection, both physical and emotional. By placing the reading bench near the hearth, Icelanders emphasized that reading, like family and tradition, was something to be enjoyed in a warm, communal space. Historians still debate whether the reading bench was solely a tool for personal reflection and family bonding, or if it also had a greater social and political role. Some argue that these benches served as informal spaces for community leaders to discuss and share legal matters, as many of the sagas involve stories of justice and governance. Others suggest that the benches were primarily for private use, serving as spaces for personal reflection, study, and cultural preservation. In either case, the reading bench played an important role in keeping Icelandic traditions alive, ensuring that the stories and values of the past were not only remembered but actively engaged with by each new generation. As we continue to look at the reading bench's impact on Icelandic culture, we should consider the material aspects of these benches, the practical elements that made them so integral to the home. Icelandic homes during the medieval period were built with simplicity and function in mind. Due to the harsh climate and the need for warmth, homes were often small and made with thick walls, typically built from timber and turf, designed to retain heat. The concept of a reading bench wasn't just about creating a comfortable place to read, it was about utilizing the limited space in the home effectively while also ensuring that the structure of the home supported the cultural practices of the family. The reading bench was typically built directly into the walls of the home, often near the hearth, which was the heart of Icelandic family life. The bench would be made from the same materials as the rest of the home, typically wood or simple stone. This design not only made the bench practical but also aligned with the minimalist ethos of Icelandic architecture. With limited space and resources, the people of Iceland adapted their living conditions to be as efficient as possible. Every part of the home, from the walls to the seating, had a specific purpose, nothing was superfluous. The bench was a perfect example of how Icelanders turned necessity into function, creating a space for reading that wasn't just physically comfortable but symbolically significant. Historians still debate whether the choice to build reading benches into the walls was a result of practicality or a deeper cultural value. Some suggest that the bench was purely a functional space, an efficient way to maximize the use of small homes, while others argue that the reading bench had symbolic importance, reinforcing the value Icelandic society placed on knowledge and storytelling. What is clear is that the bench was essential to the daily rhythm of life, and its placement in the home was deliberate. By positioning it near the hearth, it reinforced the idea that reading was an activity to be shared, surrounded by warmth and family. The reading bench also served a social function. While Icelanders were often isolated in their homes due to their rural, nomadic lifestyles, the act of gathering around the reading bench helped foster a sense of community. Families would often read the sagas aloud together, with one person reading while others listened, reflecting on the stories and discussing them. In a world where the written word was still rare and precious, sharing stories aloud in the home was a communal activity that encouraged participation. It allowed each family member to connect with the culture, to share in the history of the land, and to pass down knowledge from one generation to the next. In some ways, the reading bench mirrored Iceland's legal system as well. The sagas were not just stories, they were often records of legal proceedings, tales of family feuds, and the establishment of laws. The reading bench, in this context, can be seen as a place where legal and cultural knowledge were shared, reinforcing the importance of storytelling as both a cultural and legal activity. This connection between law and literature is one of the unique aspects of Icelandic society, as it gave people a sense of ownership over their culture and their rights. As the importance of reading and storytelling continued to grow, the reading bench's role as a cultural symbol became more evident. It wasn't just a place for individuals to engage with the sagas, it was a shared cultural experience. Icelanders saw reading and listening to the sagas as a way to stay connected to their ancestors, to learn from their triumphs and failures, and to preserve the identity of their society. The reading bench, then, became a metaphor for the Icelandic way of life, a life built on community, shared knowledge, and a deep respect for the past. This emphasis on storytelling and reading can be seen in how Iceland developed its legal system. The Althing, one of the oldest parliaments in the world, was founded in Iceland in 930 AD. It's possible that the tradition of reading the sagas aloud around the hearth helped shape the values of democracy and justice that became central to Icelandic governance. The idea of resolving disputes and sharing knowledge through dialogue, as seen in the sagas, likely informed how legal matters were discussed and decided in the Althing. The role of the reading bench in the home was part of this broader tradition, a reflection of how Icelanders viewed storytelling as an essential tool for governance and society. Historians still debate whether the Althing was the result of written sagas or if it was merely an extension of Icelandic oral traditions. However, the role of literature, and the deep respect for written words, is undeniable. Iceland's political system, rooted in the sagas, reflects the importance of reading and storytelling as tools for both personal reflection and community governance. The reading bench, with its central place in the home, was not just a place for quiet contemplation, it was a symbolic site for the preservation of knowledge, law, and tradition. As we continue to reflect on the significance of the reading bench, it's also worth exploring how it fits into the larger context of Iceland's unique literary tradition. The Icelandic sagas, which were originally passed down orally and then written down, were central to Icelandic society. These sagas were not just stories, they were historical accounts, moral teachings, and legal records all woven into one. The reading bench, often positioned in a central location in the home, played a crucial role in preserving and passing down these stories. It was not simply a space for individual reflection, it was a communal gathering place where Icelanders could connect with their heritage and with each other. The sagas themselves were a blend of myth, history, and law, and they held tremendous cultural value. They told the stories of Iceland's settlers, their struggles, and their triumphs. Many sagas also dealt with matters of law and governance, illustrating the intricate relationships between families, leaders, and the land. These stories provided a moral framework for Icelandic society, teaching the importance of justice, loyalty, and honor. The reading bench was central to this tradition of storytelling. It was the place where these values were passed down, from one generation to the next, creating a shared understanding of Iceland's culture and history. Historians still debate the role of the sagas in Icelandic society, whether they were primarily a form of entertainment or if they had deeper legal and spiritual functions. Some argue that the sagas were simply stories meant to be enjoyed by the people, while others suggest that they played a central role in the legal and political structures of Iceland. Regardless of this debate, it's clear that the sagas were a key part of the Icelandic way of life. They helped to preserve the values, traditions, and laws that shaped Icelandic society. The reading bench, therefore, was not just a place for reading, it was a place for reflection on these stories and the principles they embodied. In a world without modern technology, where books were rare and expensive, the reading bench provided an opportunity for families to come together and experience the sagas collectively. This shared experience helped to strengthen familial bonds and reinforce the cultural values of the community. In Icelandic homes, the reading bench was often a focal point of family life, where parents would read aloud to their children, helping them to understand the importance of their heritage and the moral lessons contained in the sagas. The communal aspect of reading the sagas around the bench also ties into the broader Icelandic culture of collective decision-making. Icelandic society, particularly in its early years, was built on a system of open discourse and debate, particularly in the Althing, Iceland's national assembly. Much like the discussions held at the Althing, the reading of the sagas in the home could serve as a form of dialogue, where family members discussed the stories, their meanings, and their implications for their own lives. This practice helped to reinforce a collective identity, one rooted in shared knowledge, shared values, and a common sense of history. Furthermore, the reading bench helped to foster a connection to the larger Icelandic landscape. The sagas often depicted the natural world, the struggles to tame the land, and the relationships between humans and the environment. By reading these stories near the warmth of the hearth, Icelanders were reminded of the harsh yet beautiful landscape that they lived in, a landscape that was a key part of their identity. The reading bench, then, became a symbolic place where people could reflect on their relationship to the land, their ancestors, and their place in the world. Historians still argue whether the sagas served more as a form of entertainment or whether they were a serious, foundational part of Icelandic law and governance. Some suggest that the sagas helped to cement the concept of the law assembly, and influenced Iceland's democratic ideals, as they chronicled the laws, disputes, and resolutions of the past. Regardless of how the sagas were viewed in terms of their legal significance, it is clear that they were a vital cultural tool. The reading bench, as a central feature in the home, was where these important discussions often began. In modern times, the reading bench has largely disappeared, replaced by contemporary furniture. But the legacy of the reading bench endures in Iceland's continued emphasis on literature and education. Icelanders still have one of the highest literacy rates in the world, and books remain a central part of Icelandic culture. The reading bench, though no longer a fixture in Icelandic homes, lives on in the cultural reverence for reading and storytelling. And as we consider this, it becomes clear that the act of reading the sagas on a bench by the fire was not just a cultural tradition, it was a practice that shaped Icelandic society, identity, and governance for centuries. As we continue to explore the lasting influence of the reading bench and its connection to Icelandic society, it's also essential to consider the broader implications of this tradition on the preservation of Icelandic culture and the intellectual life of its people. The sagas weren't just cultural artifacts, they were living documents that shaped the way Icelanders viewed themselves and their world. The reading bench, by serving as a focal point for storytelling and reading, was at the heart of a system that kept the community connected to its roots. In an isolated country, where the elements could be harsh and life could be difficult, the reading bench was a symbol of the enduring strength of the Icelandic spirit and its intellectual traditions. The legacy of the reading bench is also closely tied to Iceland's unique position in European history. As one of the most isolated nations in the medieval world, Iceland had a deep sense of cultural identity. Icelandic society was built on the strength of its oral and literary traditions, and the reading bench was one of the most prominent ways of maintaining that culture. While other nations were rapidly adopting more modern forms of education and governance, Iceland continued to rely on its oral traditions and written sagas as key instruments for preserving its history and values. The reading bench, more than just a physical object, became a cultural institution, one that helped Icelanders stay connected to their past and their heritage. While the use of reading benches declined over time with the advent of more modern furniture, the cultural importance of reading and storytelling remained intact. Even today, Iceland is renowned for its literary culture. Icelanders still have a strong connection to the sagas, and they continue to celebrate their literary heritage in various ways, from public readings to festivals. Icelandic authors today still draw inspiration from the sagas, creating works that continue the tradition of storytelling and cultural preservation. The enduring legacy of the reading bench can be seen in the thriving literary community in Iceland and the deep reverence for books and stories in Icelandic society. Historians still debate the role of the reading bench in the spread of literacy in Iceland. Was the reading bench primarily a space for the elite, or did it help foster literacy among the broader population? Some scholars suggest that the benches were used more by the upper classes, as literacy was often a privilege reserved for the elite in medieval Europe. Others argue that the sagas, being so integral to Icelandic identity, encouraged a more widespread literacy, with families of all social classes engaging with the sagas at the reading bench. While the exact nature of literacy in medieval Iceland remains a topic of scholarly debate, what is clear is that the act of reading was not confined to the upper classes. It was a practice embedded in the daily life of Icelandic families. The reading bench, in many ways, is a symbol of Iceland's commitment to preserving its cultural and intellectual heritage. Whether used by the elite or the common folk, it played an essential role in shaping the way Icelanders engaged with their history, their laws, and their spiritual life. By keeping the sagas alive, by reading them aloud and discussing their meaning, the Icelandic people ensured that their traditions would not be lost to time. The bench was a bridge between the past and the present, a place where the wisdom of the ancestors was passed down to future generations. In considering the role of the reading bench in Icelandic society, we also see the value placed on community and the shared experience of learning. These reading sessions, whether around the hearth with family or in the presence of neighbors and friends, were a communal activity. The stories weren't just for individual reflection, they were meant to be shared, discussed, and debated. The reading bench was where Icelanders connected not just to the written word, but to each other. Through the shared experience of reading and storytelling, they reinforced the sense of community that was vital to Icelandic life. As we continue exploring the cultural significance of reading benches in Icelandic society, let's also take a moment to consider the broader impact of these benches on the evolution of Icelandic homes and their interior design. Icelandic homes, as simple and modest as they were deeply functional and thoughtful in their design, shaped by the extreme climate and the need for efficient use of space. The reading bench, built directly into the walls near the hearth, wasn't just about comfort or practicality, it was a deliberate feature that reflected Icelandic values of practicality, community, and intellectual life. The homes of early Icelanders were built with warmth, safety, and efficiency in mind. As you imagine stepping into one of these homes, picture a single room with thick stone walls, a low ceiling, and a central hearth where the family gathered to eat, talk, and stay warm. Space was limited, and the need for warmth was paramount. By building reading benches directly into the walls, Icelanders maximized their limited space, turning every part of their homes into something functional. The bench wasn't just for reading, it served as a central place for rest, conversation, and gathering, all while being close to the hearth, which was the heart of the home. The simplicity of these homes reflected a cultural emphasis on functionality. There was little room for excess or ornate decoration, everything had to serve a purpose. The reading bench was a key example of this practical design ethos. It wasn't just a place to sit, it was a multifunctional space that served multiple purposes, a seat, a place for storage, and, of course, a space dedicated to reading and engaging with literature. In a society where space was limited, everything had to be organized for maximum efficiency. This was true for the homes as a whole and for every piece of furniture, including the reading bench. Interestingly, the placement of the reading bench near the hearth wasn't just about warmth. It was also about creating a focal point for family life. The hearth was a place for cooking, socializing, and storytelling, and having the reading bench nearby made sense both practically and socially. It was in these spaces, near the hearth and the reading bench, that the most important activities of daily life took place. Whether it was a quiet evening of reading, a lively discussion about the sagas, or a family gathering around a fire, these moments were central to the Icelandic experience. Historians still debate the precise purpose of the reading bench. Was it simply a pragmatic solution to a small living space, or did it serve a more symbolic role within Icelandic society? Some argue that it was a functional piece of furniture designed to maximize living space, while others suggest that its placement near the hearth and its use in the evening rituals made it more of a symbolic center of family life. There's also the possibility that the reading bench evolved from earlier traditions of community gatherings, where the family would gather around a central space to share stories and knowledge. Regardless of the exact origins, it's clear that the reading bench became an integral part of Icelandic culture, linking together practicality, intellectualism, and community. In modern times, we've come to think of furniture as purely functional: tables for eating, chairs for sitting, beds for sleeping. But in Iceland, the reading bench was a focal point for much more than just sitting. It was a space where culture and family life intertwined. The act of reading together, of sharing the sagas and stories, was a communal activity that reinforced the bonds of family and the larger social fabric of Icelandic society. Today, when we gather to read or share stories, we often think of it as a personal or private activity. But for early Icelanders, reading was a communal experience that helped maintain connections to the past and to each other. The reading bench was where knowledge and wisdom were passed from one generation to the next, where the laws of the land and the stories of the gods were read aloud, creating a shared experience for everyone in the home. While modern homes no longer feature reading benches built into the walls, the values that they represented, the importance of shared stories, community connection, and respect for tradition, continue to resonate today. As we look back at the reading benches of Iceland, we're reminded of the importance of connecting with our heritage, of passing down knowledge and stories, and of the spaces we create for reflection and connection. The reading bench, though no longer part of modern furniture design, still offers valuable lessons about the role of communal spaces in fostering shared cultural values. As we look back on the evolution of the reading bench in Icelandic culture, we can't help but recognize the symbolic nature of this piece of furniture. The act of sitting on a bench and reading the sagas, with family gathered around, speaks to a larger cultural tradition that valued not only the intellectual pursuit of reading but the shared experience of it. The reading bench was a site of communal knowledge exchange, a space where Icelanders came together to reflect on their past, discuss their present, and pass down wisdom to future generations. It wasn't simply a place for one person to read in solitude, it was a space for the collective, where every word read aloud had the power to shape the community's sense of self. The role of the sagas in Icelandic society cannot be overstated. These texts, filled with stories of gods, warriors, and everyday heroes, were not only epic tales but also vehicles for preserving Iceland's laws, customs, and values. The reading bench was integral to the sharing of these stories, making them a living part of the Icelandic identity. Even though much of this literature was initially passed down orally, the transition to written form made the sagas even more central to Icelandic life. In fact, as much as the reading bench symbolized family life, it also reflected the larger societal commitment to knowledge, law, and cultural continuity. Historians continue to argue about whether Icelandic literacy, particularly regarding the sagas, was truly a widespread phenomenon or if it was primarily reserved for the elite. Some believe that the sagas were mainly read by the clergy or the upper classes, while others point to the relative ubiquity of the reading bench in Icelandic homes as evidence that reading, particularly of the sagas, was a common practice across all levels of society. Icelandic society, though rural and isolated, had one of the highest literacy rates in medieval Europe, and the fact that reading benches were found in homes across the land suggests that a wide range of Icelanders had access to these stories. In this sense, the reading bench can be seen as a democratizing force, ensuring that the sagas, and by extension, the values they embodied, were available to all, not just the elite. The design of the reading bench, its place in the home, and its role in family life all point to a larger cultural investment in knowledge and education. The simple act of sitting on a bench near the hearth, reading or listening to the sagas, became part of a ritual of cultural transmission. Icelanders understood that reading was not just about the absorption of information, it was a way to actively engage with their cultural identity. The reading bench allowed for the shared experience of reading aloud, which fostered communal bonds and helped to reinforce the collective memory of their society. In this way, the reading bench wasn't just a tool for reading, it was a tool for maintaining the social and cultural fabric of Icelandic life. The reading bench allowed Icelanders to connect with their heritage, with each other, and with their ancestors. The sagas were their history, their law, and their literature, all wrapped into one. Sitting together as a family around the reading bench, listening to the tales of gods and kings, meant connecting with their past in a way that kept it alive in their present. The reading bench was where history was kept, where literature was cherished, and where cultural continuity was ensured. As time passed and the role of the reading bench began to fade, so too did the prominence of oral traditions in Icelandic homes. The advent of modern furniture, increased literacy, and changing lifestyles led to the decline of the reading bench, but its legacy is still felt in Iceland's literary culture today. Iceland has one of the highest per capita publication rates in the world, and its citizens continue to celebrate their literary heritage. Modern Icelanders may not gather around the reading bench in the same way, but the spirit of those intimate, community-centered reading rituals persists in the country's continued love for literature and storytelling. Historians still argue about the impact of the decline of the reading bench on Icelandic culture. Did it signify the end of a more communal, story-based way of life, or did it simply mark the beginning of a new era of literacy and intellectual engagement? Some suggest that as Icelanders moved toward a more modern way of life, they lost something of the communal bonding that the reading bench represented. Others argue that the tradition of reading and storytelling is still very much alive in Icelandic society, but it has simply adapted to new forms. Ultimately, the legacy of the reading bench in Iceland is a testament to the enduring power of stories and the places where they are shared. Whether through the simple act of reading aloud to family members or through the modern, independent act of reading a book, the Icelandic commitment to literature and learning continues to shape the country's identity today. The reading bench may no longer be a common sight in Icelandic homes, but its role in shaping Icelandic culture and preserving its literary traditions remains a part of the national consciousness. Now that we've examined the cultural significance and enduring impact of the reading benches, let's consider how this practice of integrating reading into daily life contributed to the intellectual vibrancy of early Icelandic society. The reading bench wasn't just a functional piece of furniture, it was a focal point for learning, socializing, and preserving the Icelandic way of life. But the question remains, why were the Icelanders so invested in literature and reading? What was it about their society that made them place such importance on the written word, particularly in a time when many European nations were still focused on oral traditions? Iceland's unique geographical isolation likely played a role in fostering the deep connection the people had with storytelling and the written word. In a small, sparsely populated country like Iceland, the daily rhythm of life was shaped by the land and its harsh climate. Icelanders lived in close-knit communities where social ties were strong, and the need to pass down knowledge was critical for survival. Oral traditions were initially the primary means of preserving stories, customs, and laws, but as Iceland moved toward the 13th century, there was a growing desire to record these traditions in writing. The sagas, which told stories of gods, kings, and heroes, were the backbone of this written tradition. They served not only as a form of entertainment but also as a way of preserving history and law. The sagas were deeply rooted in the lives of the Icelandic people, connecting them to their past and reinforcing a shared sense of identity. The written word was essential for transmitting knowledge and maintaining the continuity of Icelandic culture, especially in a society that was built on the idea of collective memory and shared responsibility. Historians still debate the exact origins of Icelandic literacy. Was it influenced by the Christian Church, which brought Latin literacy and the idea of written texts, or was it more deeply rooted in the native Icelandic traditions of oral storytelling? Some argue that the Icelandic Church, with its emphasis on learning and scripture, helped spur the development of written Icelandic. Others believe that Iceland's intense focus on literature and storytelling was more indigenous, shaped by a society that valued both oral and written traditions equally. The creation of the reading bench, in this context, can be seen as a tangible reflection of this commitment to literacy and storytelling. The bench, built into the walls of Icelandic homes, provided a dedicated space for the act of reading, reinforcing the importance of literature in both daily life and spiritual practice. One of the most interesting aspects of the reading bench is how it created a space for communal engagement with literature. Icelandic society was built on shared values, with people coming together to discuss laws, stories, and customs. The reading bench wasn't just for individual reading, it was a communal space, often shared by family members. The sagas were not just read in solitude, they were read aloud, discussed, and debated in the warmth of the family home. Parents would tell stories to their children, and families would gather around the reading bench to engage with the tales that shaped their cultural identity. In this way, the reading bench became a focal point for family life, bringing people together and encouraging dialogue around the stories that defined Icelandic culture. Historians argue whether the Icelandic approach to literature and storytelling was unique to their geographic isolation or whether it was an integral part of the broader European tradition of oral and written storytelling. In some ways, Iceland's isolation allowed it to maintain a unique literary culture, one that didn't rely on the influence of other European nations but developed organically within the community. The reading bench, as a central feature of Icelandic homes, reflects this sense of independence and self-reliance. It wasn't just about reading, it was about creating a space for dialogue, reflection, and connection to the past. This brings us to the question of how the reading bench fits into the larger picture of Icelandic history. The sagas weren't just stories, they were political documents, legal records, and social commentary. The reading bench was, in many ways, a reflection of how Icelanders saw their place in the world and their relationship to law and order. By reading the sagas aloud, families weren't just passing the time, they were reinforcing the principles of justice, law, and social responsibility that were at the heart of Icelandic society. Historians still debate whether the reading benches played a central role in spreading literacy across Iceland or if they were primarily used by the upper classes. Some argue that the benches helped foster a culture of literacy among the common people, while others suggest that literacy was more confined to the clergy and elite. Regardless of the specifics, the reading bench symbolizes the importance of written and oral traditions in shaping Icelandic culture. It was not just a place for rest, it was a space for the sharing of knowledge, for engaging with history and law, and for maintaining the cultural continuity that defined Icelandic society. As we continue to explore the deeper implications of the reading bench in early Icelandic homes, it's fascinating to consider how these benches were more than just a place for reading, they were also a reflection of the broader Icelandic way of life. Icelandic society placed great value on communal living, knowledge sharing, and cultural preservation. The reading bench, as a focal point in the home, represented these values. It was the place where families came together to engage in storytelling, pass down traditions, and maintain a shared connection to their history. But how did this practice influence the development of Iceland's societal structure, particularly its legal and political systems? Iceland's Althing, one of the oldest parliaments in the world, was deeply influenced by the sagas and the tradition of reading them aloud. The sagas didn't just preserve Icelandic history, they were also records of the law. In fact, many of the early sagas contain detailed accounts of legal disputes, settlements, and governance. The reading bench, then, can be seen as a place where not only stories were shared, but also where legal traditions were discussed and internalized by the community. By regularly reading and reflecting on these stories, Icelanders weren't just learning about their ancestors, they were also learning about the laws that governed their own lives. Historians still argue whether the reading bench had any direct role in the creation of Iceland's unique legal system, or if the practice of reading the sagas was simply a byproduct of their strong oral tradition. Some suggest that the formalization of Icelandic law came directly from the traditions captured in the sagas. These sagas were not just stories, they were practical, codified accounts of how Icelanders believed law and justice should function in their society. The sagas provided a cultural framework that guided social interactions and conflicts, which could be directly referenced in the Althing. The reading bench, then, was not just about cultural transmission, it was about ensuring that the rule of law and the values of the community were upheld for generations to come. The reading bench's role in facilitating the connection between the written word and the oral tradition cannot be overstated. In many ways, these benches helped preserve the unique Icelandic blend of oral and written culture. While oral traditions often place greater emphasis on memorization and storytelling, the written word allowed for greater permanence and precision. The reading bench, a seat where families could gather to listen to stories, allowed for both of these elements to coexist, reinforcing the idea that Icelandic society was built on a shared memory, a collective history, and an ongoing dialogue between the past and the present. One of the most significant aspects of this practice was the role of the law speaker, who would recite parts of Iceland's law code aloud during the Althing. These public recitations were a blend of oral and written traditions. Icelanders would have been familiar with these laws not just through reading but through hearing them spoken aloud, sometimes as a communal event at the reading bench or in public spaces. The sagas, which were often written down by clerks at the Althing, became a kind of living text. It wasn't just a book on a shelf, it was a source of living, breathing knowledge, shared between generations. As we continue to think about how the reading bench served as a site for the transmission of culture, we can also consider the ways in which the practice of reading the sagas shaped the Icelandic sense of community. The sagas were not just stories for entertainment, they were a form of social glue, binding people together in shared understanding. The reading bench, as a space where the sagas were heard, wasn't just about individual reflection, it was about shared knowledge and collective identity. It was through these shared rituals, sitting on the bench together, that Icelanders reinforced their bonds as a society. The sagas, in this context, acted as both a mirror and a guide, reflecting the society's values and offering direction on how to live in accordance with those values. The importance of the reading bench as a communal space is also reflected in its design. The bench wasn't just a place for individuals to read privately, it was a space designed to foster family interaction, group storytelling, and the passing down of culture. Its location near the hearth, often considered the heart of the home, created a warm and inviting space for families to gather around. Icelandic homes during this period were typically small and sparsely furnished, so every piece of furniture had to serve multiple purposes. The reading bench's design reflected this. It was not only a place for reading, but a space that encouraged conversation, bonding, and cultural preservation. Historians still argue whether the communal nature of the reading bench was a product of necessity, due to the small size of Icelandic homes, or if it was an intentional cultural practice that fostered community cohesion. Some suggest that the reading bench served as a practical solution to limited space, while others contend that it was a deliberate effort to create a shared space for cultural engagement. Either way, the fact remains that these benches were central to Icelandic homes, playing a crucial role in the transmission of knowledge, the preservation of cultural values, and the reinforcement of community bonds. As we dive deeper into the social and cultural significance of the reading bench, it's important to understand how these humble yet powerful pieces of furniture influenced Icelandic social life beyond the family unit. While the reading bench served as a focal point for families to come together and engage with literature, it was also part of a larger tradition of community engagement. Icelandic society was one of the few in medieval Europe where literacy and education were not solely confined to the upper classes or the clergy. In fact, Iceland had one of the highest literacy rates in Europe during the medieval period. So, what made Iceland different? Why was there such a widespread focus on literacy and reading, especially when many other nations of the time were still primarily oral cultures? One reason for this literacy boom was the unique structure of Icelandic society. Because Icelanders were isolated, they had to depend on themselves for much of their daily needs, and storytelling and reading became vital tools for preserving their laws, customs, and history. Every part of Icelandic life, from the sagas to the daily activities around the reading bench, contributed to the development of a culture that highly valued education and the written word. This widespread literacy, and the role of the reading bench in cultivating it, set Iceland apart from much of the rest of medieval Europe. Historians still debate whether this literacy was the result of a deliberate cultural policy or if it evolved naturally due to Iceland's isolation and need for self-sufficiency. Some suggest that Iceland's geographical isolation played a major role, as the people had little access to foreign influences and developed a unique system of education and governance through their own cultural practices. Others argue that the influence of the Christian Church, which brought written texts and religious literacy to Iceland in the 10th century, had a profound impact on increasing literacy. Regardless of the cause, the widespread access to literature, particularly the sagas, was a defining feature of Icelandic society. The reading bench, positioned in the home near the hearth, was central to this cultural tradition. The sagas, which were read aloud or shared within the family, were not simply for entertainment. They were used to teach, inform, and preserve the legal and moral codes that governed Icelandic society. As such, the reading bench wasn't just about physical comfort, it was a space for intellectual and moral development. Children would sit with their parents and listen to stories that taught them about law, justice, morality, and history. It was a family-centered activity that engaged everyone in the preservation of Iceland's cultural heritage. Some scholars argue that the reading bench's communal aspect extended beyond the family unit, suggesting that the bench might have been used for gatherings of the larger community. These communal readings, whether around the hearth or in public spaces, would have helped to reinforce the shared cultural identity of the community. The sagas, with their complex stories of familial loyalty, justice, and law, were a way of ensuring that the community remained united under a common set of values and beliefs. The reading bench thus became a key component of Iceland's sense of community and identity, helping to shape how Icelanders viewed themselves and their relationships with each other. What's particularly fascinating about the reading bench is its symbolic connection to the wider Icelandic culture of self-governance. In Iceland, the legal system was rooted in the sagas, which provided detailed accounts of how justice was administered. The sagas weren't just stories, they were living documents of the Icelandic legal and political system. This connection between literature and law is unique to Iceland and further emphasizes the importance of the reading bench in everyday life. It wasn't just a space for intellectual activity, it was a space for engaging with the moral and legal frameworks that govern society. Historians continue to debate the precise role of the reading bench in this process. Some believe that the bench was simply a tool for reading and family engagement, while others suggest that it played a larger role in the practice of governance and justice. By providing a central place for reading and reflecting on the sagas, the reading bench may have acted as a subtle but important element in ensuring that Icelanders remained connected to their laws, their ancestors, and their culture. Whether it was used by the family for private reflection or in the community for shared learning, the reading bench helped to shape Icelandic society's commitment to literature, law, and justice. As we continue to reflect on this unique aspect of Icelandic life, it's clear that the reading bench played an essential role in maintaining both the intellectual and social fabric of Icelandic society. It wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was a central space for the transmission of knowledge, values, and traditions. Through the practice of reading the sagas aloud, Icelanders were able to preserve their culture, pass down their laws, and reinforce their shared identity as a people. The reading bench, humble as it may seem, was a crucial element in the creation of a society that valued education, community, and cultural continuity. As we continue to explore the cultural and intellectual significance of the reading bench, it's essential to consider how this practice influenced Iceland's unique literary legacy. Iceland remains one of the few places where medieval literature, particularly the sagas, still holds a cherished place in daily life and national identity. The reading bench, as a fixture in homes, was crucial in fostering this culture of reading, particularly among the Icelandic elite and common folk alike. It allowed the sagas and other forms of literature to permeate everyday life and ensured that knowledge was passed down through oral and written traditions, even to those living in remote areas. Iceland's commitment to preserving its literary heritage is evident in the way the reading bench became a part of the social and cultural fabric of Icelandic homes. Whether the family was gathering together to read, listen to a saga, or engage in family discussions, the bench symbolized the Icelandic devotion to knowledge and the written word. In an age when books were rare and expensive, the act of reading aloud together in the home was a way of ensuring that even the simplest members of society could engage with Icelandic culture. Families would gather around the reading bench not only to read stories, but also to reflect on their shared history, laws, and identity. The reading bench thus became a place for learning and sharing. Though Icelandic literacy might have started as a privilege of the elite, the practice of reading aloud to children on the bench likely ensured that literacy spread among the common people as well. Many Icelandic homes would have had at least one reading bench, and the idea of listening to the sagas read aloud was embedded in the collective identity of Icelanders. The sagas were not merely stories to be enjoyed in silence, they were meant to be heard and understood in the context of family and community. The bench allowed the sagas to take on a living, breathing quality, keeping the stories fresh in the minds of the people, generation after generation. Historians still argue whether the Icelandic reading culture was widespread, or if it remained the domain of the elite or clerics who had access to the limited books of the time. Some suggest that the reading benches were mostly used by the wealthy or by clergy members who had the education and resources to read and interpret the sagas. Others argue that, because of the Icelandic devotion to oral traditions, reading became a practice that spread to a wider portion of the population, including farmers and tradespeople who may have had little access to formal education. The reading bench, in this case, was the great equalizer, allowing anyone to engage with Icelandic culture, if only through listening to the stories that defined their nation. The intellectual vibrancy created by this culture of shared reading can still be seen in Iceland's literary traditions today. Icelanders continue to read and produce literature at a remarkably high rate, with books being an integral part of Icelandic life. While the reading bench may no longer be a central feature of Icelandic homes, the values it represented, the importance of education, the transmission of culture, and the preservation of identity, are still fundamental to Icelandic society. Each year, Iceland celebrates the Icelandic Book Month, where books are shared, gifted, and discussed among families and communities. This celebration of literature is a direct reflection of the values that were nurtured around the reading benches of centuries past. Interestingly, the concept of reading as a shared family activity continues to resonate beyond Iceland. Around the world, family reading traditions have become important tools for building connections between generations, and the communal aspect of reading remains a cornerstone of many educational systems. The modern idea of the family reading nook, though much more comfortable than a bench against the wall, is a descendant of the Icelandic tradition of gathering around the hearth and the bench. It's clear that the desire to make reading a communal, cultural practice that is accessible to all is a tradition that persists today, albeit in different forms. While Iceland may no longer use reading benches, the spirit of communal reading, as seen in the historical context of these benches, continues to thrive. The legacy of the reading bench is a testament to the resilience and continuity of Icelandic literary culture. From the sagas written on parchment to the books passed down through generations, Icelanders have ensured that their cultural history is preserved not only in the written word but in the act of sharing those words aloud with each other. The reading bench was more than just furniture, it was a tool for creating connection, for passing on wisdom, and for maintaining the integrity of a society built on storytelling and law. Historians continue to debate whether the decline of the reading bench represents the end of a particular phase of Icelandic culture or simply the evolution of how literature is shared and experienced. However, what is clear is that the core values of Icelandic society, the importance of storytelling, community, and education, continue to thrive in modern Iceland. Whether through literature, festivals, or family reading traditions, the legacy of the reading bench lives on in the hearts and minds of Icelanders today. As we reach the final chapter of our journey through the fascinating world of Icelandic reading benches, it's important to reflect on how the practice of storytelling and the cultural significance of reading continue to influence Icelandic society today. While the physical presence of the reading bench may have disappeared from modern homes, the values it represented, the importance of literature, oral tradition, and community, still resonate deeply within the fabric of Icelandic culture. In a world that increasingly prioritizes digital devices and solitary activities, Iceland continues to hold its literary traditions close, preserving the communal spirit of reading and storytelling that started with the reading bench. The most significant aspect of the reading bench legacy is its role in creating a shared cultural space for learning and reflection. In the past, the reading bench wasn't just a space for personal relaxation, it was a gathering point for families to share stories, learn from each other, and bond over the shared experience of connecting with their cultural heritage. This spirit of communal learning and reflection remains strong in Iceland today. Icelanders take great pride in their literary heritage, and reading is not just an activity, it's an essential part of their identity. From children learning to read the sagas to adults participating in national discussions about literature, the Icelandic love for reading is woven into the very structure of the country. Iceland's continued devotion to its literary traditions is exemplified by its remarkable literary output. Iceland has the highest per capita publication rate of books in the world, a testament to the enduring importance of literature in Icelandic society. The tradition of storytelling, which was once practiced around the reading benches of Icelandic homes, lives on in the form of modern authors who draw inspiration from the sagas and the cultural practices that kept these stories alive. The role of the sagas in Icelandic life, as both entertainment and law, has shaped the intellectual landscape of Iceland for centuries. Today, Iceland's literature continues to reflect the values of its past, exploring themes of identity, justice, and community, just as the sagas did. Beyond the written word, Icelanders still gather to share stories, whether in book clubs, literary festivals, or community events. The sense of connection to the past, to the traditions of storytelling, and to the collective memory of Iceland is still very much alive. The reading bench, with its symbolic connection to communal reading and reflection, is reflected in these modern gatherings. Icelanders continue to value the act of sharing stories aloud, whether through reading or conversation, fostering a sense of community and continuity across generations. While modern Icelandic homes may no longer have built-in reading benches, the spirit of those benches lives on in how Icelanders approach literature. The act of sitting together to read, share, and reflect on stories is still a vital practice in many homes across Iceland, creating spaces where family members can connect to their cultural heritage. The reading bench, though physically absent, has been replaced by new forms of communal reading spaces, and yet the underlying cultural value remains unchanged. Literature is not just a solitary pursuit, it is a communal activity that binds people together. This enduring love for reading and storytelling is also evident in Iceland's continued emphasis on education. Iceland has one of the highest literacy rates in the world, and reading is a cornerstone of the Icelandic education system. The educational focus on literature and storytelling, from early childhood education to higher education, reflects the lasting legacy of the reading bench. It is a continuation of the tradition that began in Icelandic homes centuries ago, where reading wasn't just about absorbing knowledge, it was about becoming part of a larger, ongoing conversation about culture, identity, and the values that define Icelandic society. As we reflect on the cultural significance of the reading bench, it's clear that this simple piece of furniture played a far larger role in Icelandic society than just providing a place to sit. It was a symbol of connection, both to the past and to each other. It was a space where stories were shared, values were transmitted, and Icelandic identity was nurtured. The legacy of the reading bench reminds us of the power of stories to connect generations, the importance of community in preserving culture, and the enduring value of literature in shaping societies. In closing, the reading bench represents more than just a piece of furniture, it is a symbol of Iceland's commitment to preserving its cultural heritage, its devotion to literacy, and its ongoing love for storytelling. While the benches themselves may no longer occupy the homes of Icelanders, the spirit of the reading bench, the shared experience of reading, reflecting, and connecting, is alive and well. Iceland's literary tradition, built on centuries of reading and storytelling, continues to thrive, ensuring that the values of the past remain a vibrant part of the nation's future.